Good evening, everyone. It's really good to be back with you again. As we always say, there's simply so much going on, and we'll probably be slightly limited on time to be able to cover all of it. We'll be covering the main breaking events, particularly in Lebanon, that are very much related, of course, to what is happening with the so-called ceasefire between Iran and the Zionist bloc, Washington and Tel Aviv. Although allegedly, of course, Tel Aviv has no influence over the US negotiations, but we'll come on to how that is palpably untrue. And I think, first of all, Fee, I'd like to start with, I recommend that everybody follows Fee on X, or on her Substack, on Telegram, and so on, because both of our work is being heavily shadow banned and censored across all platforms. And Fee, I think you're probably one of the very few, indigenous / Western journalists on the ground at the moment covering the elections in Peru. And I've been watching the short reports that you've been putting out, which are really good. And I think just bring everybody up to date with what is happening, how it's going to impact on the Latin America arena generally, and is it continuing down the same path that we've basically seen much of Latin America head down, particularly since Trump's election?
Yeah, so man, where do I begin? This election has been a disaster. It's been a complete, total disenfranchising of the voice of the people. I mean, ultimately, this is an election that 5 years ago I covered. I was here on the ground doing the same thing, and that election went much better. It was the same outcome. Basically, we had the running was the daughter of Alberto Fujimori, who is the former Peruvian dictator that went to prison for crimes against humanity. He did a lot of things, and he was in power in the country for 10 years. And some people liked him because he was very much like a heavy-handed guy, and he reined in a lot of things. But the majority of people saw a lot of repressions, a lot of just turmoil. And he was, of course, helped by the CIA with his right-hand man being directly working with them during that time. And so his daughter is running for president for the 4th time. And she has had a very strong influence in Peru's Senate, the equivalent of what would be like a Congress. That the entity there is so powerful that no president has been able to fully govern in any way, shape, or form in the last decade. We're talking 9 presidents in 10 years. This is an absolute insanity. Any president that gets in there ends up in jail. And sometimes it is valid on corruption, and the people don't tolerate it. But mostly it is because Keiko Fujimori's party, which is called Popular Force, it translates to that in English, is pretty much in charge of the manipulations of everything. She is backed by multinational corporations. She is backed by the West, by the United States. I would compare her to Hillary Clinton in terms of her politics and where she stands. Unfortunately, for Peru, though, as well, you also have a lot of crime, right? So there's a lot of crime that's gone up lately. And again, so there hasn't been a stable presidency. The last president, Pedro Castillo, who won that year in 2021, was jailed 2 years into his presidency. He wasn't allowed to basically do anything whatsoever. And he was jailed because he talked about nationalizing the lithium, as Peru sits in the lithium triangle. He talked about getting a new constitution to balance the power structure. And he was riddled with a bunch of bogus charges and placed in jail. And he is now, of course, calling for his freedom. There are a lot of people speaking out about his freedom, and trying to get him out. But unfortunately, he went to jail. And then his vice president, Dina Boluarte, was the one that became president. She was actually extremely corrupt, betrayed the party. And then we've had two presidents since then. One was also kicked out for corruption, and then the next one is the one that's there now. And it's kind of complicated. So I'm just generalizing this so we get to the point of what's happening now. And so that's where they're at. And there's been an increase in crime. Now, there's also an increase in xenophobia and hatred towards Venezuelans, who, of course, most of them were anti-Nicolas Maduro, who have been coming into Peru the last few years. Most Venezuelans that come are obviously regular people. They work in restaurants, they work as taxi drivers, like any immigrant population will do when they first go into a country. But that's caused a certain amount of xenophobia, because along with the majority of Venezuelans coming in, there's been an influx in crime. And some of these are allegedly tied to certain gangs that have come up, and they have been essentially extorting small businesses and mom and pop places to pay fees. And if they don't pay these fees, before they would just shoot up the place, steal, or whatever. Now they're assassinating people. And so these extortionists are a huge problem, mostly for who? For the poorest people in the city. So what that has caused is it's caused a shift towards the right, because normally working people tend to be more focused on social, economic issues, programs, the sort of income inequality, that sort of thing. Well, now the primary focus from the left to the right is crime. And every single person that I spoke to on the ground would tell me the number one thing was crime. Like, they need to stop this. They're killing people. They'll go on the buses, which working people take, and they'll start killing the bus driver if they don't pay up, that sort of thing. So it's gotten pretty bad to that point. And so there's been a slew of right-wing candidates running a very similar type of campaign to Javier Milei in Argentina, and to Donald Trump and Nayib Bukele, right? They're looking at trying to get people in prisons, trying to bring in order. So law and order, that sort of mentality. And so normally the working class that tends to vote left has begun shifting to the right and demanding and voting for right-wing candidates. Simultaneously, the more educated, more university, scholarly academic youth and other people who are in the workforce have shifted left, wanting to bring the country forward. So it's an interesting dynamic. That's in Lima. Outside of Lima, most people understand that all the wealth and the natural resources of Peru tend to go out to other countries, particularly Western countries like the United States. And so that understanding is more prevalent outside of Lima. So you have another candidate who goes by the name of Porky. His name is Aliaga. And he has been vying head to head with another candidate named Roberto Sanchez, who is a more left-leaning candidate who was part of the former president's party. And he started his own party now. So what's happened is people went to vote on Sunday, and they literally could not vote because the trucks that were delivering the materials didn't get there on time. Supposedly, they didn't have the materials were delayed. And so they didn't have the ability to start the polls, because everything is done by hand-counted paper ballots, which should be a pretty smooth process. But it's they never received them. So a lot of these places, polling locations, opened late. People were waiting in line, so there was long lines. And then, of course, in the poorest of places, one of the cities called San Juan de Miraflores, where in the mountains is where the poorest people live. There's the roads are not paved. They don't really do any upkeep there. It looks like a completely different world than in other parts of Lima. Well, they never got the materials at all. And people were still there at like 6 o'clock when the polls supposedly closed, and they were demanding to vote. So the organization in charge of the electoral process, the national electoral process, the JNE, decided to extend the voting day till Monday. And so people were able to vote on Monday, but Monday's a work day. This is why elections there are done on a weekend, because more people can vote. So people have been saying this is absolutely unfair. They can't trust the results. There's been a lot of accusations of fraud, both ballots not arriving or ballots being already marked. And this is all across the country, but especially in Lima. So now what the count is going very slow. So they're still like at 93%. And the two candidates that are vying for second place to go into the next round in June are Roberto Sanchez and Lopez Aliaga, known as Porky. If a candidate like Porky or Keiko gets in, I think Peru will help the United States usher in the era of where they take over the entirety of the Americas, which is their goal. And that is where we're headed. It is a very dark place. There is a possibility that that doesn't happen because Peru will remove presidents like no other. There are indigenous populations that have before come into the capital and protested, and there are indigenous movements similar to Bolivia. But as we saw, Bolivia is now under the control of a pro-Zionist, pro-West leadership. We have Ecuador, where they're starting this takeover, which is insane. It's of course under the guise of controlling narco, gangs. This is the excuse, and I feel like they're going to try to do the same to Peru. Next month we have Colombia's elections, and that's also in danger. And then Brazil, which Bolsonaro, the Zionist, ultra-Zionist president. Former president's son, is running against Lula da Silva. So basically, what I'm looking at this to finish up here, I see it as a complete takeover of not just Latin America as a whole, but all of the rich resources that are there, all of the minerals, especially lithium, and also we have gold and silver here. And as these governments go more towards the right, there's going to be a lot more of that Bukele style type of leadership. And I just see this just being a disaster for the sovereignty of all the people of the area, the region.
To what degree do you think this is, like, I know there's a lot of talk at the moment about the technates, about the creating of spheres of influence, the divvying up, if you like, of these spheres of influence between particularly US and China, but also perhaps including Russia, although I'm a little more dubious about that. And we've talked about this, that I think Russia is in danger of being squeezed out of that equation. Of course, it has dominance in the Arctic, and of course, that's why Greenland now is being targeted. Also, how feasible that is in the short term to reduce Russian dominance. Trump's doing deals or suggesting deals with Erdogan to basically reduce Russian dominance in the Black Sea. So, I think while we've talked about Russia through Kirill Dmitriev, who's very much supported by Putin, heading very much towards some kind of deal with Trump, although we're still not sure. I mean, I saw something from John Helmer just before I came on saying basically all of Dmitriev's efforts apparently haven't persuaded Trump to extend the 1-month sanction lifting on the supply of Russian oil. So it's kind of, yeah, I mean, we've talked about this, we still don't really fully understand why Dmitriev is being given such a free rein. And I think both of us have described the fact that Lavrov is pushing back to a degree against it. I think there is, as we've talked about before, division between certainly the foreign ministry and the Dmitriev collection, let's say, because I presume Dmitriev isn't working alone. But I'm digressing slightly there anyway. I just got onto that subject. But in Peru, I wanted to ask about privatization, nationalization. At the moment, what is the situation with the resources themselves? That's the first question. And then, to what extent is China kind of invested in Peru? And do you think basically Trump's agenda or the agenda of the oligarchy in the United States is to squeeze out any Russian Chinese influence in the whole of Latin America eventually? And presumably that's part of what's happening now in Peru.
Yeah, I actually think that last part you said, I'll start with that. I do think that the United States empire, we've talked about this before, it is falling apart in terms of what it used to be, and it's transforming itself into what it's like shedding its skin and showing actually what it is, which is an empire that it's just focused on resource extraction and building in order to compete with China. And I don't say that in a way to dismiss anything else happening right now, but when we're talking about a powerful country that has the capacity to take on the United States, it would be China in terms of its economic power. And how they've been competing in this way. The thing is, ultimately, I don't feel like we're going to see that battle. I think the way a lot of people are viewing it, because I do think China is extremely business-minded and moves in such a way. And one of my good friends described it. China is communist in name, but really in its government and its economic pursuit, it is capitalist to the core, to the max. And so China's looking at Latin America as a competitive ground for a fight against the resources against the West. Peru in particular, and I've mentioned this before, they have built a lot of businesses. There's lots of Chinese businesses. You can get Temu here, not Amazon. Like you'll have, they have their certain alliances, and the business sector in Peru, and particularly Lima, where all this is happening, are very open to both Chinese and U.S. investment. But they have been saying that they prefer working with the Chinese because they feel they do get more of an equitable relationship, more of a, I would say, what seems to be a win-win, because the port that was built by the Chinese, the Shanghai port that I've mentioned, before, was built just less than 2 years ago. And it was a huge investment of like $3 billion of this underwater, this port that has cut the time of transport. And this particular port has given a lot of jobs to people. It's created a very beneficial relationship for a lot of business-minded people here. Now, what has the United States really done in Peru? Not really. I mean, nothing really of any sort of investment. And so a lot of the businesses here are looking for China to help build more public infrastructure, because, for example, Lima's traffic is absolutely horrible, and it could use something like a train, right? They have a small train, but they don't have something that's more extensive. And I was actually, I don't think I've talked about this with you, but I was actually in Chile recently. When you look at Chile and you look at the history of Chile and Peru were at a war years ago, and they have this history. It's almost very similar terrain. It's just farther south. It's a small little bit of land, but they're also in the Lithium Triangle. But Chile underwent, of course, Allende's government and then Pinochet's government. They have a much more right-leaning population, but one that's already been pretty much taken over by the United States. And you can see that when you go to Chile, you use the dollar. like mostly. Like the Chilean peso
Okay.
basically doesn't count. And so it's become this sort of, it almost felt like I was in the United States when I was in Chile. I did not feel like I was in Latin America. I felt like I was in like Miami or something. Like it was quite jarring, because I did like how everything was more organized and the roads where people weren't driving like maniacs. But at the same time, I felt like I didn't feel like there was an identity. I didn't feel like I could see, like, I don't know. I didn't feel like I was in Latin America. I felt like I was in the West, and a mix of like Europe
Right.
and the United States. And I think a lot of people that go there would probably tell you the same thing, right? And so that's kind of what I imagine is a similar kind of end goal for the majority of Latin America. And that's why I'm
Right.
saying this, because that's what the United States wants, and they want all of it in order to compete towards China's influence, I think, in West Asia, but Southeast Asia as well, and Africa, because we also have to talk about that and what's both China and the US have been doing in Africa, as you well know. And I think that's essentially going to be the pattern that we're going to replicate. Now, Peru's national resources are mostly controlled by multinational corporations, except I would say the Amazon,
Right.
which is being fought, right? And that's why it's so important when we look at what's happening in Colombia, because both Colombia and Brazil also have part of the Amazon. And it's not a coincidence that we're seeing this destabilization happening in Peru, because what does that do? It allows intervention, especially from the nearby US, which has more of a proximity to Latin America, that will allow them to pretty much easily take it over. And as we've seen Pete Hegseth say, everything, all of this really belongs to us. It doesn't belong to like South America. This is us all the way to the Arctic. I mean, that's what they're planning. They're telling everybody
Yeah.
what they want to do, and that's what they're doing.
Well, and basically folding in Canada, Latin America, that's what I'm saying. You're starting to see this sphere of influence coming into shape, right? It's starting to kind of appear very visibly now through what they're saying. Trump has been talking about absorbing Canada for some time. I mean, I know it's kind of comical on one level, right? Trump's complete megalomania on this. But at the same time, it's effectively, it is taking effect in Latin America. Definitely, we're seeing it take effect right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I just, there's so much to say about the Russia thing that I think ties into all of this, but yeah, just, I'm watching this election. I think they're going to try to take it towards the right, because that would just be that's it. Like, it's another added layer. But I think it's weird. It's weird that in Peru, the one thing that they do have going for them is that people will be out in the streets and they will protest if they feel like something isn't fair, either way. And the crime is getting out of hand in terms of it's a different world if you're these people that have to face this every day. And I think that's also causing more of an understanding. When I found myself talking to people here, I found that they were extremely knowledgeable compared to if I did the same thing in the US, that like right. The political knowledge in the US is next to zero. And we're talking about a developing country, and the people here actually know what's going on in their government. Whereas in the United States, you ask young people what's going on and they look at you like deer in headlights. They don't know. It's getting better with the younger generations. But there's still a long way to go. So yeah, I guess that's the wrap up for here. But we'll see what happens, and there will be, just so everybody knows, there will be another election, because they have 2 rounds. They have the first round and the second round.
Right.
And there were 35 candidates. So in order for one candidate to win the first round, they would have to take 50% plus 1. Nobody was going to take that with 35 candidates. So there's 2 people are going to go into the next round, and that will take place in June. And in July, the president will be sworn in, and there are vast chances that whoever that is, there's going to be some sort of protest. So I guess that is something that will kind of keep it from being such an easily subdued population. But I mean, the all the signs are there to what the United States wants to do. So, yeah.
Interesting. Sorry, just one last question. Is there a big American presence inside Peru? I mean, do you notice it when you talk about multinationals?
Yeah, so the multinational businesses is done with the elite class in Lima that have had a lot of money here for a while. In fact, some of them are, I think one of them is now tied to the crown. I forget which European country, but there is like, long term old money, and it's those people that basically run the economics of Peru. And it's the vast difference between most people in Peru, especially Lima, and the people who have a lot of money is absolutely astronomical. Like, you see like the difference. There's less and less of a middle class. I mean, there is a middle class, but it's less and less. And I'm actually seeing this dynamic spread throughout the world, including Russia.
Yeah.
I feel like we are entering a global recession where we are seeing it pretty much touch everywhere. I'm not so sure about China, but I can definitely say that in Russia and most of Latin America, you're seeing that income inequality having increased, and you're seeing the wealth be more so manipulated and geared towards families, like the certain families. And that's what we've been talking about with us. We've been talking about how this is going to transition from nation states into, these groups of international elites or predators that basically are running the show. And the thing is, the only thing here is they're behind the digitalization. They're on their way, but they're behind that. There's a bit of a hesitancy towards that. Whereas in Russia and China, I see them running directly at warp speed towards that. So it is because of that. But yeah, the American presence here is mostly, I would say, in the tourism industry, in the upper echelons of people who have come here to work and all that stuff. That's the American influence. And in terms of who these families do business with, that's where the influence is.
Are there NGOs? American NGOs, have they kind of infiltrated to any great extent?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not entirely sure of the specifics, but there's definitely NGOs here. There's definitely American companies and American influence, but it's not anywhere near what it is in Chile, where you have Walmarts, where you have IKEAs, and it's like basically really? There's it's like I said, that's basically like being in Florida. It did not feel, or California. But Peru still has, like, for example, you'll still see mom and pop shops, but they're the ones being attacked. They don't attack the corporations, but they attack the mom and pop shops. But you're also seeing the Chinese corporations that have come in here. One of them is called Wong. You have that influence as well. So you can see it in the reflection of the products that are being sold. The cars too. You see a lot of Chinese cars here, where in the United States you see none of them. So some of the same cars that we have in Russia, you see them here as well. So you can see that influence is there for sure. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. Well, I mean, I think maybe the segue into what's happening here. I mean, I wanted to read out, this was I sent it to you, the Chinese Foreign Minister, Wang Yi, his statement on Iran. And of course, currently, Trump, I think there's some division over whether Trump is bluffing, whether he really thinks he can blockade the blockade, basically. As far as I know, today in the Hormuz Strait, there were a number of US sanctioned ships that transited perfectly okay without being stopped by or boarded or anything else or hindered by American efforts. And so I do kind of wonder if it is a major bluff by Trump, as having run out really of options to pressure Iran. 40 days of bombardment and warfare didn't succeed. I mean, Iran was prepared to continue and is prepared to continue. But what kind of fascinated me, and I'd like to get your point of view on this. So basically, and we had the Russian-Chinese abstention on the Bahraini tabled UN Security Council resolution, which effectively criminalized Iran for defending itself against Israeli-US aggression. That's the bottom line on that one. And China and Russia abstained. But they then vetoed the proposed resolution that was going to, in inverted commas, protect shipping in the Hormuz Strait, right? Which I found quite interesting. And of course, many people were very positive about it. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't be, but at the same time, they're only going to veto or abstain if their interests can be served by either action, right? And so immediately my feeling was, particularly China is not going to want other international efforts in the Hormuz Strait because it's benefiting from what's happening in the Hormuz Strait because its vessels are being allowed through by Iran, of course. Although now I am seeing there are plans going through in Iran where the payment for the oil is now being done inside China. And so Iran now is able to some degree ask for better pricing. Plus, of course, there's a deficit of oil coming to China because of the takeover of Venezuela. And so to some degree, Iran is also benefiting from this, which is correct in my opinion. So I'd like to get your point of view on why they vetoed this bill but abstained on the first resolution. And the second thing, I'll get back to the statement by the foreign minister. So he said basically Iran's rights must be respected. China supports Iran's national dignity and calls for, and I'm underlining this, a ceasefire and negotiations. So what does this say to me? This says to me that pressure was put on by China. Nobody has actually said this, but I'm making that leap from this statement, which is again pushing for ceasefire and negotiations, which are not necessarily to the benefit of Iran. They never have been. The US has attacked Iran during negotiations the last two times. Qasem Soleimani was invited to negotiations with Saudi Arabia and Iraq when Trump assassinated him. Qatar was bombed when negotiations with Hamas were ongoing. So pushing Iran, in a sense, towards ceasefire negotiations, in my opinion, it isn't in the best interests of Iran. But it is potentially in the best interests of China, of China. And that makes me ask the question, was China involved in bringing Iran to the table in the first place? Because China has very good relations with Pakistan, although Pakistan is also, of course, again, you see there the competition between China and the US. Israel also has influence through the US inside Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, because Saudi Arabia has been radicalizing Pakistanis through the madrasa, through the Islamic Wahhabi schools in Pakistan for decades. So there's a whole kind of melting pot of influence in Pakistan. And I wonder whether China used its influence to push forward the ceasefire. I'd like to sort of get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I fully agree with you. And I think it's pretty obvious to me that that's exactly what happened and the reason why they actually use their veto the second time. It affects them, right? This is even what a lot of the people who understand China or who always talk about China say. China doesn't quote unquote get involved, but the reality is they move depending on what affects them and what doesn't affect them. And if it's going to impact them, and this exactly is impacting them more than it's impacting everybody else, including Russia or the United States, then of course they're going to change their tactic. It is not this altruism that people apply to both Russia and China. It is not some sort of like, oh yes, we're going to join Iran now. We're doing this because Iran deserves to defend itself and exist. That's not the driving motivation. And I don't know why people keep applying that when it's clear through China's actions that they move pragmatically and they do things based on what is going to be a better outcome for them. They don't go necessarily in gung-ho like the United States and in that sort of way. And this is what even people who deal with China here say. Like we know that they have an interest for themselves in mind, that they're benefiting and profiting from these investments. So it's the same way that China profits from investments in Latin America or in Africa. Well, yeah. And I also think that China being used, and both China and Russia have been used to push a ceasefire between Iran and the United States and Israel, benefits them as well to the core of the business transactions that China has with Israel, that China has with the Gulf, the political relationships that they have with the Gulf. That is not going to be thrown away just based on the fact that Iran needed to defend its sovereignty. But ironically, if it was the other way around, if say it was Taiwan, right? They lead with this idea of sovereignty, but it really truly is about economics. And what I find just tiresome now is how people just continue to pretend that it's anything more than just an economic necessity for them in terms of the Strait of Hormuz and in terms of what that does to them and economically. And I think what we really have to look at in how we're analyzing what's happening geopolitically is really not what is said, because what you just read, the statement from Wang Yi, it's very much in a very eloquent stated statement of supporting Iran and supporting a ceasefire, positioning itself as a peacemaker, as a negotiator. But it leaves out the reality, the truth, the raw truth that it is about, money, and it's about oil, and it is about all these other things, and competition, of course, with the United States, because it is to China's benefit too, for the United States to lose, right? It is in that way financially, to be for the dollar to decline and for yuan to be used. That's a motivation for them, right? And how do you not talk about that? How do you not see that?
Yeah, exactly. And I think this is very much about, we've talked about the financial system in Iran, the usury-free banking that was brought in as law in 1983. And even Catherine Austin Fitts, again, I think I sent that to you, where she said the Iranian financial system is outside of the global capitalist system, and therefore it has to be folded in for this kind of oligarchy, financial surveillance, tech tyranny to come in. And of course, if we look across the region of, what did we have? We had independent banking. We had countries like Syria that were not in debt to the IMF. You had Libya, of course, that was progressing and developing pan-Arabist, pan-African components within the country, right? So it had to be destroyed. Even here in Lebanon, and we've talked about this, Hezbollah has usury-free banking, the Qad al-Hassan banks, which are now being systematically bombed by Israel because they can't be allowed to exist. Nothing is going to be allowed to exist outside of that global capitalist system. That's the problem, let alone become strong enough to compete with and to offer an example. This is what they're afraid of. This was why the war against Yemen began in 2015, because Saudi Arabia didn't want a progressive, relatively democratic country. Because when the bombing began, Jamal Ben Omar, who was the UN peace envoy to Yemen, said, you don't need to bomb. They've resolved the situation themselves. They've constitutionally elected a government. It's peaceful. And then, boom, Saudi Arabia bombed it. Because the last thing they want is any node in this global capitalist chain to be shown up by states or even non-state actors that are demonstrating how life can be. That's what it comes down to. And so therefore Iran was the last on the 7 countries that General Wesley Clark talked about, because it's the most powerful, because it's the most representative of this alternative system to what everyone is buying into, including Russia and China, by the way.
Yeah.
This is the point. And Russia and China are relatively happy to operate within that system. They might compete within that system. They might try and find ways to outdo the US within that system. But, where are we with de-dollarization? Has it actually happened? Is it something that is genuinely going to happen? Yes. Okay. Now Iran is trading either in Iranian rial or in yuan, I don't know, on China's territory, rather than going through payment systems that are going to be sanctioned by the US or can be visibly sanctioned by the US, right? So yes, people are going to find ways around it, but actual de-dollarization, I don't know if that's possible, particularly with BRICS now. You have India that's fully aligned basically with the US and Israel. You have Russia, we've talked about this, that is not only very much aligned with Israel, it is attempting to get a foothold into dealing on a partnership level with the United States, which, again, we've talked about, seems to be an insane step to be taking. And China that will deal with anyone that's in the interests of China. They're heavily invested in Israel itself. They're heavily invested in the UAE, Saudi Arabia. And as you mentioned, that's where their protectionism comes in of the Zionist Arab states in the Persian Gulf. And hence, in my opinion, one of the reasons for that abstention of the Bahraini UN Security Council resolution. So yeah, it's kind of it's sort of fascinating who is benefiting and who is maneuvering in this ceasefire and negotiation with Iran. They're now talking about potential for extending it, which I don't know. I find this very difficult to, not necessarily to understand, because I don't pretend to be any expert or to understand what Iran's strategy really is. I know we're hearing here today that a ceasefire is supposed to come into effect. Trump has made the announcement that it will come into effect 5 p.m. Eastern time. I'm hearing that pressure was put on by Iran as part of the ceasefire negotiations, which, to be fair, they had put ceasefire in Lebanon as virtually number one on the agenda. But what we've seen, of course, as soon as Trump says something or Washington says, no, okay, there's a ceasefire, what does Israel do? It increases its bombing, it increases its occupation, it increases its invasion of southern Lebanon right now. And I think it was Mohammed Marandi who, in an interview, said basically the Americans were kind of heading towards some kind of common ground on the Iranian points until Vance received a call from Netanyahu. And then suddenly everything fell apart, and Vance was suddenly in a very bad mood, etc., and they left. Right. So we can only take from that Israel, as we kind of know, is controlling America's actions. And I think there was another analyst who basically said the Americans came without a mandate to be able to do anything, basically. So it was just a fact-finding mission to see perhaps how far the Iranians would go, to what degree they would stick to the points they were making or they were demanding, etc. But ultimately, the decision was not going to be made by them. They had no power to actually either concede or compromise or agree to any of the Iranian points.
I think in this scenario, I always want to remind people, though, the Americans fund Israel. The Americans provide a lot of the weapons, a lot of the things for Israel. I have a hard time knowing what I know about the Americans, that they are not at some level. I'm not saying it's the Vance level or even the Trump level, but at a level that is what we would call the deep state, that they are not one and the same pushing the exact same thing that Israel is pushing. So what I'm saying is the relationship is more of a bad cop, good cop scenario. I don't think that it's as simple as, say, Netanyahu giving Trump orders. I think it's more so like there is an understood overarching control that where presidents we know in the United States don't run the country, where the intelligence military apparatus runs the country. And so that entity is fully in line with Zionism. It's fully in line with this fascistic push to literally take over to Gazify southern Lebanon, essentially, to Nakba southern Lebanon, which is what they're doing, and to continue doing that to the entire region, including Iran. I don't think it's just Israel in terms of the mechanism, the government behind it, but it is the Zionist mentality, whether it's the Christian Zionism, because what a lot of Americans end up doing is, for example, saying that if the U.S. is then controlled by Israel, then the U.S. is free of any sort of accountability for that. So that's kind of what the way I'm looking at things in this in regards to everything that's happening too.
I think it suddenly came to mind when we're talking about Russia and the exaggeration or misinformation on social media over, this is the war that China and Russia are winning, etc. But I had to smile today because I think it was Iran Screenshot put out a picture of Chancellor Merz with what is effectively a copy of a Shahed drone painted black. As they said, painted black so we don't recognize it. And so that technology has come from Russia using extensively Shahed drones or Iranian drone technology in Ukraine. Ukraine is obviously, because it's a collaboration between Germany and Ukraine. Ukraine has obviously, downed one or picked it up, reverse engineered with Germany, and now they've produced. So effectively, well, hold on, isn't Russia supplying drone technology to Iran? But the fact is that actually Iranian drone technology is advanced to a point where Ukraine and Germany are copying it to actually, increase their capability. So I just had to kind of drop that in there. I also, because when I mentioned this to Ehsan Safanajad, not on interview, but I just sent the post to him, and he said, yeah, but it's ridiculous, because he said they can't produce at the level that Iran can. Because I saw something today that Iran now is producing 10 times the number of suicide drones that they were producing before the war, which is quite an extraordinary statistic if you think about it. So even after all of this damage and 40 days of bombardment, etc., presumably targeting development centers and production centers, although many of the missile cities seem to be deep underground. So, I just find that quite interesting. By the way, we now apparently have Ukrainian special forces again on the border between Syria and Lebanon, just as they were in Idlib, of course, before Al-Qaeda broke loose and with the help of a number of parties made it to Damascus back in December 2024. So, that collusion continues. But
Vanessa, just two things before I let you continue. I just wanted to mention that the United States is in no way, shape, or form going to back off of Iran, because they have been sending more and more troops. They have been moving they did this a year ago, I think. Last year. The age of automatic registration from 18 to 26 for everybody, and then extending the age even later on. They are pushing more troops into the region, and they are moving their weapons. And also now we just got word that they are going to General Motors and all of these car companies and saying, hey, would you be willing to produce weapons? This was only done during World War II. It was done also by the Nazis as well, but it was also done by the United States, this sort of production. And so I don't see how they are going to respect any sort of ceasefire, which is why to me it's diabolical that that allies of Iran would try to push Iran towards a dead-end ceasefire. I also don't claim to know the strategy that Iran is using. But as I found myself to be far more distrusting of the U.S. government and far more critical than the people of other countries. And I think we've talked about this before. In Russia, same thing. And, in the region as well, they give them the benefit of the doubt too much in general. These people are evil. We're not looking at reasonable people. You're looking at people who are the face of even worse people. More psychopathic than Hegseth and Trump and Vance and all of these people combined. I mean, we're talking about just deeply, deeply evil people. And at the risk of sounding insane, there's been a lot of weird events happening that in Israel. I don't know if you saw the crows, the bees, and I'm like, wait a minute, I'm not a religious person, but this is a little bit too much. Then you see the birds destroying the Israeli flag. I'm like, thank you, but it's just there's just so much of this. It's kind of weird for me, I think, at this point to try to reason with these people, because there is no reasoning, and ultimately the only other choice is war. But I'm not trying to tell anybody what to do, and I'm not trying to minimize the sacrifices being made by Iran and the resistance alone in fighting this Epstein cabal. But it is a requirement that I think humanity fight it, because otherwise this isn't just going to end in South America or the West Asia. This is like the mental thing. This is like an